You're about to find out that something you do every single day, or something someone you love does every single day, might be the single oldest habit on planet Earth. Older than farming. Older than houses. Older than language itself, maybe. And it didn't start with a cigarette. It started with an accident, around a fire, tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. And it didn't start with a cigarette. It started with an accident, around a fire, tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. Not cigarettes. Not cigars. Not the coworker who corners you by the building entrance for 15 minutes you didn't have. We're going back to the very first moment a human being looked at burning smoke and chose, on purpose, to breathe it in. And here's the twist nobody expects: tobacco isn't where this story begins. Not even close. Tobacco shows up almost embarrassingly late to its own party. So where does it actually begin? With fire. Obviously you need fire before you can smoke anything. And our relationship with fire goes back further than most people imagine. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists pulled up burnt plant ash and scorched bone roughly 1 million years old. Not scattered wildfire debris, but the signature of a fire someone tended, inside a cave, on purpose. The someone wasn't even Homo sapiens. That was Homo erectus, smaller brain, heavier brow, zero patience for instructions. They gathered around flames. They cooked. They warmed themselves in the dark. And every one of them, every single day, for hundreds of thousands of years, breathed smoke. It was unavoidable, the original bad air day, with nobody around to complain about it on an app. Here's where it gets strange. Wood smoke isn't the only thing that comes off a fire. Burn different plants and you get a completely different chemical mix. Alkaloids, terpenes, compounds that don't just float past your nervous system, they knock on the door. Some of the plants growing wild across ancient Africa, Europe, and Asia were psychoactive. Which means some of our ancestors were getting high completely by accident, with absolutely no clue why the evening suddenly felt incredible. And their brains weren't confused by it. Humans carry an endocannabinoid system, receptors built into us for regulating mood, memory, appetite, long before any human ever lit a cannabis plant on fire. So when smoke from one of those plants first drifted into someone's lungs, their brain didn't short-circuit. It recognized the signal. Researchers who study this call it exactly what it sounds like. The brain was already waiting for that knock. Sit with that for a second. The multi-trillion-dollar global tobacco industry. Centuries of sacred ritual. Entire medical traditions built around smoke. All of it may trace back to one tired hunter who happened to sit downwind of the wrong shrub. And had, completely by chance, the best night of his life. History has a sense of humor. Now, important distinction because this is where people get the story wrong. Humans accidentally inhaling smoke and humans deliberately growing things specifically to smoke are two very different claims. Now, important distinction because this is where people get the story wrong. Humans accidentally inhaling smoke and humans deliberately growing things specifically to smoke are two very different claims. Wooden incense burners held stones heated to extreme temperatures, and the residue on them came from cannabis plants bred for unusually high potency. Not rope-grade hemp. The good stuff. And it was buried with the dead on purpose. That's 2,500 years ago. But here's the question worth holding on to. Just because we haven't found older proof, does that mean it didn't happen earlier? A pouch of leaves rots back into the soil long before any archaeologist shows up with a brush. Missing evidence here is not the same thing as evidence that it never existed. A pouch of leaves rots back into the soil long before any archaeologist shows up with a brush. Missing evidence here is not the same thing as evidence that it never existed. Then there's the Herodotus problem. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian described a nomadic Eurasian people called the Scythians sealing themselves inside small tents, heating stones until they glowed, throwing hemp seeds onto them, and inhaling the smoke while, in his words, howling with pleasure. For ages, historians figured he was embellishing. Then archaeologists started digging up Scythian burial mounds and found exactly what he described: bronze braziers, scorched stones, hemp residue. Herodotus wasn't exaggerating. If anything, he undersold it. Now, the plant most people actually picture when they hear smoking: tobacco. It belongs to the Nicotiana family, and it is purely a New World plant, meaning Europe, Africa, and Asia had never even heard of it until contact with the Americas at the end of the 15th century. When Columbus's ships landed in the Caribbean, his crew watched locals walking around with small glowing rolls of leaf, breathing the smoke out through their noses and mouths. Within weeks, the sailors were trying it themselves. Of course they were. But tobacco's actual history in the Americas stretches back far earlier than 1492. Chemical residue inside ancient pipes pushes the timeline back at least 3,500 years in the southeastern United States. And some researchers think cultivation in the Amazon basin could reach back 10,000 years or more. It healed. It carried prayers to the spirit world. It sealed agreements between tribes. Blowing smoke towards someone was a blessing, not a habit. A shaman lighting tobacco wasn't taking a break, he was opening a line of communication between the living and the divine, with the smoke itself acting as the messenger. That's why so many indigenous cultures treated it with such discipline. You don't chain smoke something you consider holy. The idea of tobacco as a throwaway, everyday habit, something for a lunch break or a bus stop, is largely a European invention, and a fairly recent one. Here's a piece of the story almost nobody's heard, and it might be the oldest direct evidence of intentional smoking ever recovered. In 2019, researchers excavating a hearth in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert found seeds from Nicotiana attenuata, wild tobacco, packed into a roughly 12,000-year-old fire pit. Here's a piece of the story almost nobody's heard, and it might be the oldest direct evidence of intentional smoking ever recovered. In 2019, researchers excavating a hearth in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert found seeds from Nicotiana attenuata, wild tobacco, packed into a roughly 12,000-year-old fire pit. Which raises an obvious question: if people in Utah were feeding tobacco to a fire 12,000 years ago, what were people doing with the psychoactive plants growing in their own backyards everywhere else on Earth at the exact same time? Because humans were already spread across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia by then. The drive to alter consciousness isn't an American story. It's a human one. Here's where the story gets genuinely wild, taken seriously by real anthropologists, not fringe theorists. It's called the intoxication hypothesis. Across nearly every culture ever studied, people have sought out fermented drinks, psychedelic mushrooms, smoke, chewed leaves, and swallowed seeds, completely independently of one another. That pattern is so universal that psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel argued in the 1980s that the urge to get intoxicated functions as a fourth biological drive, right alongside hunger, thirst, and sex. And not just in humans. Elephants seek out fermented marijuana fruit on purpose. Siberian reindeer eat Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and other reindeer then drink their urine, because the psychoactive compounds pass through intact. Reindeer running their own recycling program for getting high. Respect. If that drive really runs that deep, it's not a stretch to imagine early humans, long before pottery, long before pipes, deliberately seeking out smoke from plants they'd learned, through trial and error, changed how they felt. Sometimes that trial and error killed you once, which is one time too many to learn from personally. But the survivors remembered, and they told the next person, and that knowledge moved forward. Not written down, just lived, and passed mouth to ear around a fire in the dark. There's another layer almost never mentioned: smoking as medicine, long before it was either ritual or recreation. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts on Earth, written in Egypt around 1550 BC, describes inhaling smoke from heated herbs specifically to treat the throat and lungs. Sounds backwards by modern standards, treating lung issues with smoke, but some of the herbs they used, including henbane, genuinely do have pharmacological effects when inhaled. The ancient Greeks did the same thing with therapeutic fumigation. Hippocrates, yes, that Hippocrates, wrote about inhaling herbal vapors to treat lung disease. The logic wasn't absurd for its time. Smoke reaches the lungs directly, so if the plant has medicinal value, smoke delivers it fast. We still use that exact principle today: inhalers, anesthetic gases, nebulizers. The delivery method survived. The burning part, thankfully, mostly didn't. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine, over 3,000 years old, even has a name for it: Dhumapana, literally smoke drinking, inhaling specific medicinal herbs through pipes for specific conditions, with detailed protocols refined over centuries. China, Mesopotamia, Greece, India, virtually every early civilization on record used therapeutic smoke inhalation, not out of addiction or fashion, but because it worked often enough to keep doing it. In a world with no antibiotics and no surgery, work sometimes was a genuinely high bar to clear. And there's a social angle that rarely gets airtime. Humans survived in groups, and group trust was a matter of life and death. Shared rituals, including shared altered states, are one of the most powerful tools humans have ever found for building that trust. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Shared ritual experiences measurably synchronize brain activity and deepen group bonds. So when a circle of ancient people sat together breathing in smoke and entered an altered state collectively, that wasn't recreation. That was social infrastructure, the thing that let a group walk into danger together and trust they'd come back out together too. And then comes the uncomfortable turn in the story. When tobacco reached Europe in the 1500s, it spread fast enough to feel almost contagious. Within decades it went from exotic curiosity to continental obsession. Snuff became aristocratic fashion by the 1700s. Cigars were everywhere by the 1800s. By the early 1900s, the industrial cigarette had arrived, cheaper, faster, more addictive than anything before it. What indigenous cultures had spent millennia turning into something measured and sacred, European industry compressed into a mass-market product in under 400 years. Then the 20th century happened. The tobacco industry spent decades and billions of dollars burying its own internal research linking cigarettes to cancer. They marketed to kids. They paid doctors to vouch for their products. They engineered the chemistry to hit harder and faster, maximizing addiction by design. The same plant a shaman once placed on heated stones during a sacred burial in 500 BC was, by 1960, the subject of a corporate memo about how to market it to teenagers. Same smoke. Almost nothing else in common. So when did humans actually start smoking? Honestly, we'll probably never know the exact moment. Physical evidence takes us back roughly 12,000 years with confidence, and likely much further with reasonable speculation. But the drive underneath it, the urge to alter consciousness, to ritualize shared experience, to use smoke as medicine, is almost certainly older than any artifact we'll ever dig up. It might be as old as fire itself. It might be as old as the moment our minds first learned to connect cause and effect. That burning plan made me feel different last time, so let's do that again. That's not addiction. That's intelligence switching on. What we do know for certain: this behavior predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates every civilization taught in a history class. By the time written records begin anywhere on Earth, humans were already deep into finding ways to breathe in smoke on purpose. The plants changed. The rituals changed. The reasons changed. The behavior itself was already ancient before anyone thought to write it down. There's something almost poetic in that. For everything that separates us from our ancestors, the technology, the medicine, the internet, the absurd volume of content we consume daily, there are a few threads that run, unbroken, through 100,000 years of being human. Fire. Smoke. Breath. The same smoky air drifting off a bonfire tonight is the same air our earliest ancestors sat in. Somewhere along the way, someone started paying attention to what it did to them. Then they started choosing it. Then they passed that choice down. To the Scythians howling with pleasure in their tents, to Egyptian physicians prescribing henbane smoke, to shamans reading visions rising off a fire, to a beach full of Taino people watching bewildered Europeans cough their eyes out trying tobacco for the very first time. So the next time you flip a light switch, or sit by a fire on a summer night, or just catch a stray whiff of wood smoke in the cold, you're part of something far older than you think. You're doing what humans have always done. You're breathing.